When you look at the international treaties that Mahmoud Abbas signed in April of last year, and the characteristics which they say they wish to identify in the Palestinian state, the chances are Palestine could become the only genuinely democratic state in the Middle East. It's not democratic because 20% of the citizens have almost no rights at all. It's a state. It's a religious state for a privileged majority. Yeah.
Let me say something quickly about the Holocaust. Some of the leading figures in the pro-Palestine advocacy movement around the world are very significant figures with Holocaust parent criteria, credentials, I suppose you'd say. One of them is Norman Finkelstein, who's one of the most prolific and most important writers, historian, devastating critical analyses of what's going on. And he says that, of course, it's the lessons of the Holocaust and his parents' experience that motivate him, and that's one example. The other one I wanted to mention, but I didn't, but I'm happy for the chance to do it now, is Amira Haas. She's coming to Australia. If you don't know who Amira Haas is, she's one of the best journalists in Israel, writing for Haaretz, and she lives in Ramallah. And her parents, her mother at least, was a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp. She explains what she does, and I have to say, I don't know what the right word is, whether proud or pleased, or I don't know exactly right. My mother was also a survivor of Auschwitz, and my father was a survivor of the concentration camps elsewhere. And it just was instinctive for me to see my motivation exactly like Amira Haas's. But it's very different from the lesson which the Jewish community as a whole claimed to teach from the Holocaust. So let me tell you what Amira Haas says. She says her mother, when she got off the cattle trains, the cattle trucks as they came into Bergen-Belsen and was going to the concentration camp and the ovens, whatever they had there, she saw the German women watching. And she remembered after the war and said that after the war, those women couldn't say they didn't know what was going on. And Amira Haas told the story to say that she now sees her responsibility as telling the Jews that you can't claim you didn't know. We grew up with contempt for the Germans who said that they didn't know anything, like that character in that Hogan's Heroes. That was made a joke of. But it was a serious sense of disgust that we had at Germans who pretended. Now often they didn't know, but we feel they should have. It was a culpable ignorance. That's right. No, but what I'm saying is that these Jews that I'm citing take a lesson from the Holocaust, which is quite different from the appalling justification for everything that Israel does. So we know the story there, but that's the motivation and the right lesson from the Holocaust.
Resolution to the conflict. I was reading Jeff Halpart, the Jewish-Israeli peace activist, anti-Zionist peace activist, in league with the late Eric Hobsbawm and Tony Judd, described Israel as a belligerently intolerant, faith-driven ethno-state intent on ethnic cleansing. But they also argue that a two-state solution is no longer viable due to the fact that there are two independent peoples fighting over the same territory. And their argument is that Israel has to radically transform itself from a Jewish state to a secular, binational state. So the possibility of a one-state solution, a democratic Israel-Palestine, where all people share equitably in the land and the resources, as a full democracy, as a possible solution.
Palestine is already one state, except that a large part of it is occupied. It includes up to 5 million people spread around in refugee camps without any reference to the diaspora, and it includes the 1.7, 1.8 million, half of whom are children in the Gaza Strip. So it's already one state. I think the two-state is a con trick. The question is whether the rules of international law, which gives you the basic justification for the premise of the Russell Tribunal, will be sustained. And the business of, the pathways to reconciliation, it may seem incredibly idealistic even to use the word reconciliation with regard to the future of one state. The reconciliation clearly has to occur between Hamas and Fatah as well, but the reconciliation requires the acknowledgement by the government of Israel of the extraordinary brutality that they have committed against the people of Palestine since 1948. You can't, if you want a Truth and Reconciliation Commission a la Desmond Tutu tradition, you have to have that acknowledgement if there's going to be a chance of building a different future. And of course it takes a lot of courage to say sorry.
I'll just say a quick word of disagreement with Stuart on this. There's a lot of discussion about two states and one state. Jeff Halper's pushing very hard, of course, for one state, as many are, seeing the realities which make it inconceivable you could unscramble the egg on the West Bank. On the other hand, people like Chomsky argue that it's completely fanciful. He's often asked, is he in favour of one state? And he says, look, he's in favour of love and peace and, you know, international goodwill. The question is, what's the practical possibility of making even a step towards that? And nobody has the faintest idea how to go one step towards a one state. His argument, and I'll give you one quick piece of evidence for two states. In fact, on the West Bank, 85% of them are economic migrants. They're there because they're heavily subsidised by the State of Israel, and they don't even know about the politics of it. They're just there because they're getting cheap free housing and living very well. 15% of them are those crazy, you know, fundamentalist people who think God gave it to them. Now, if a Palestinian state were declared on the UN 242 principles, the 1967 border, and certainly the financial incentives were given to the settlers, most of them would leave. So I've seen arguments that make a two-state solution more viable than it looks, and in any case, it's the only realistic one. And one other quick point, which Norman Finkelstein also makes. He says, look, you can't have it both ways. You can't, as we do, argue for international law and then not acknowledge that Israel also has a right to its borders in international law. It's a state that... Now, the one-state solution is telling the Israelis to simply dismantle their state. Now, that's Finkelstein's argument. You can see the point. You can't have it both ways. He's saying that if you're going to argue that there are laws and there are rights in international law, then you can't simply take away the state of Israel. Now, what you do there and how fair the state is, that's a different discussion. So that's the other side, which I'm a bit sympathetic to, I have to confess.
Could you help me understand why so many good people who claim to support peace and justice are so opposed to the BDS movement? I was a student during the apartheid days in South Africa and wouldn't buy oranges from Israel or apples from South Africa, and I was really passionate about the role boycotts played in the transformation of South Africa. So why is there such opposition to the BDS movement, and why do so many people say, oh no, we must talk to Israel, boycotting them is not the answer? Now, I'm also a psychotherapist. I worked a lot in addiction treatment, and when somebody is violent or they have an addiction, there are times where boundaries are necessary, and times when to actually talk to someone who is behaving in an abusive way is actually colluding with that behaviour. So my understanding is that the boycott movement is saying, because I heard Stuart use the word collusion a lot in his talk, and I think it's a very helpful term, so actually saying, no, I won't talk to Israel at the moment while you are behaving in that abusive, violent manner.
Well, as part of your psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic qualifications, let me jump to our typical thing that academics do. They immediately think of a book, somebody else's book or an article, they quote from it. But Eric Fromm escape from freedom from fear means you don't have to think about anything. That was the justification for fascism. To avoid overcoming fear, you just colluded with this establishment line. And the other side of that coin is that courage is a rare quality in public life. You're sitting next to somebody who you may know something about, who does have a lot of guts in the public forum on this issue. And that's why I'm talking about Jake's prosecution by the Israeli law firm Shurat Adin for essentially supporting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. People don't want to scratch their heads either. They don't want to inquire. And unfortunately, courage diminishes the closer you get to Canberra on this and all sorts of other issues, partly because of the absurd deference to the mainstream media, who only parrot one cowardly line about this sort of issue. And in particular in Australia. I mean, the tradition I wouldn't claim to be a psychotherapist, as you know, but I do know how to draw a line in the sand. I've spent a large chunk of my career supervising psychopaths. I'm not talking about members of the Politics in the Pub Committee or the University Senate. Is this being recorded? So you have to draw a line in the sand and say, look, mate, this is not for your own. We can't tolerate this. We only have a short time on the planet. This isn't good enough. And that's why I support the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. But people have to overcome their fear. They have to take a risk. The only risk people are encouraged to take is to advance quickly to Coles or Woolies in case there's a special on pork chops at the weekend. Did you find that helpful, Peter?
Very, thank you. So let me pick up on one of the
pork chops.
One of the reasons that it's become toxic and creating an enormous amount of difficulties goes back to the issues that I raised in relation to the Jewish community's response. Let me say something quickly about that. They have disgracefully compared it, with some considerable success, with the boycott of Jewish shops in Germany in the Nazi period. They do it publicly, and really disgracefully, I keep saying disgracefully, our politicians have echoed that. Rudd, I think of, and probably Julia Gillard, and I've heard several politicians who will echo this comparison. And of course the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby, will play on this very explicitly to say, we've seen this before, we know what boycotting Jewish shops is. Now, that's a scandal for a couple of very obvious reasons. Firstly, some of the main targets for the boycott movement, the BDS movement, are not Jewish. Veolia, Motorola, G4S,
Caterpillar.
Yes.
Which one?
Caterpillar.
Caterpillar, there's a bunch of them. So that puts the pay to that argument. It's just a complete scandalous misrepresentation. If you read the charter, the kind of manifesto for BDS by Omar Barghouti, who we're hoping we might see in Australia one day, he makes it very clear that BDS is a human rights, international law-based movement which opposes racism in all its forms, explicitly opposing anti-Semitism. Now, there's nothing you can point to in BDS that deserves to be dismissed as anti-Semitic, but that's had a great success in, again, hosing down criticism, and people are scared and nervous to do it. And they oughtn't to be, and they should stand. Look, this is very serious because in Canberra and elsewhere, people are scared to touch it. I've recently spoken to the Greens who got very badly burned by this, and I was pleased to be invited to launch a little booklet on Palestine with the Greens. And I was telling them they should just get over it and stand up and stand on the high moral ground and the high legal ground. And I've also argued in the organisation on which I'm the executive, the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, they've just avoided coming out publicly on BDS, contrary to many people feeling that they ought to. And the reason was that the unions and some churches are nervous about it. And I said that we're the most respectable group standing up for Palestinian rights in Canberra as we lobby, and who better to do it than us, where we have such a distinguished group of people who stand for human rights. Let the Israel lobby say their worst against us, and they'll be exposed as you know, being ratbags, basically.
Yeah, Brian Concaman. Two quick questions. The first is about the assassination by Mossad of the Hamas operative in Dubai, where they forged Australian passports. Kevin Rudd expelled the Israeli diplomat over it, and the faceless men came into action and replaced him with Julia Gillard, who was more Israeli friendly. But Tony Abbott and Julie Bishop both said there's nothing wrong with Israel doing that. They're under attack from terrorists. I'd just like to know your response to that. And my other question, Hamas, they were created by Israel to counter-attack Fatah and PLO. but they went rogue, and now they're an enemy of Israel. I'd just like to know your views. Do you think they're freedom fighters or terrorists?
Well, on the first question, just let me say about terrorism, that the record shows, it's an impressive book by a guy called Rommel, or not to be confused with Rommel, R-U-M-M-E-L, that shows in terms of figures that something like 20 times as many people have been murdered and killed by operatives of a state as compared to people who are allegedly terrorists who are opponents of the state. So if you look at the reasons for the Russell Tribunal and the genocide committed by America and its allies over Cambodia and over Vietnam, you'd have to, or the continued use of murder by drones, you'd have to question the behaviour of any state, including Israel. With regard to Hamas, look, I had the privilege, along with Richard Falk, to spend some time in Qatar Christmas before last, talking to the two leaders of Hamas. And if you're in dialogue, admittedly through interpreters, but if you're in dialogue with them, their rationale, their dignity was no different from the conversations I've had with diplomats and representatives of other states. I mean, it seems to me if you define people as always the black sheep of the family, right, then you justify your existence by always having a scapegoat. I mean, families do it, and international relationships people do it, but they don't like to acknowledge that they do it. Peter.
Look, one of the things that occurs to me too that I want to say straight away is that if you look at the founding fathers of the State of Israel, some of whom became prime ministers of Israel, like Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, they were out-and-out terrorists, blowing up civilians and doing atrocities and so on. So, okay, that's the first thing to say. The other thing to say is that Hamas has changed, and the world's expert on Hamas happens to be a Jewish woman, another one of Holocaust parents, Sarah Roy. She's a political economist who's written the most important works on Hamas, and I've been trying to get her to Australia. She may still be coming. I'm working on getting her. I was trying to get her onto the Sydney Writers' Festival, but she may still be coming in May. When you read her book, I'll just give you the sense of the contrast. Hamas has this appallingly terrible charter, which the Jewish community will always cite because it's really an anti-Semitic piece of shit, actually. But Hamas has evolved. It's become a very pragmatic organisation, and in fact, firstly, they're not fundamentalist religion in their raison d'etre. They're a social movement, and that's why they got voted in on a democratic basis, which was fair and universally approved and internationally supervised. So the people who in Gaza, as Stuart mentions, people like Shamik, who is the student here, and others, they're not especially fans of Hamas, but we've talked to others, Christians and others from Gaza, who voted for Hamas, knowing full well that these people were running the entire civil society and all of the social welfare organisations. And more importantly, I can't document this, but I can let you have the documentation. I've had arguments online with people where I've gone to the sources of the repeated attempts of Hamas to make a reasonable settlement with Israel. They're presented as though they don't want to, but in fact, Gideon Levy in the Israeli Haaretz again wrote a piece a few months ago, listed the demands of Hamas and said, what's unreasonable about any of this? Now, if you go to the evidence and look at the repeated evidence, for example, when they were about after the 2012 war to make some kind of peace agreement, Gershom Baskin, who was doing back-channel negotiations with Hamas, had a document which was about to be a peace agreement. They assassinated the Palestinian leader, the guy who was about to sign the paper. What the fuck is going on? Well, you know, so...
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Lenore, I'm a teacher unionist, and thank you very much for your address tonight, and to Cathy for the poetry. I mean, it's, as you said, Peter, statistics can sometimes reframe the whole debate, and one of the things that really jumped out at me was that the 44% of the population of Gaza is aged from 0 to 14 years, which makes this essentially a war on children. And the whole struggle, it seems, continues to destroy the hopes of a younger generation. And Cathy's poetry pointed to that so, poignantly. But I guess my question is that the Four Corners program on children in administrative detention just turned people's heads. It was the topic of conversation at work, and because I am a teacher, that just blew people away that children were treated like that, and the aspect of torture and the violation of human rights. So I guess, is this an aspect of the whole struggle that could be better highlighted, that should be pointed out to people, and could bring, the work of highlighting the work of people like UNICEF in those areas so important?
Look, that's an enormously important and very good question. I was going to say something about this, and I'll take the chance now to just quickly say something. One of the shocking things about the Gaza assault this last time, which was the third time in the last 7 years that they've done this, 500 children were killed. One of the things that I found very difficult was I was watching this online a lot and looking at these heartbreaking, harrowing photographs. And it's very hard not to be totally distraught at watching the grief of parents and the whole stuff. It's not shown in the public. I mean, I've got pictures I was going to bring along. If I had PowerPoint, I would have put them up. You may have seen, in fact, many of you wouldn't have seen. Let me ask, how many of you have seen pictures of Shujaiya? Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a suburb of Gaza. I'm going to hold it up just to wave it around. This is a picture, and this is relevant to your question. I brought two pictures along to show you. I don't know if you can see this. This is an entire residential district of apartment houses that has been reduced to rubble. And if you just look at this, I had a quote from Bertrand Russell about the Vietnam War. If you just know about the amount of ordnance, he said, that was dropped on, in those days, Vietnam, but you just look at this picture, it tells you everything that you have to know from a moral and human point of view. You don't have to know much more. I tweeted this picture, and I've never had 3,000 retweets. I put under it, something about, rockets my ass, or some, appropriate comment.
Is that the philosophical comment?
That's right. No, but the point is that one of the disturbing features of the public and the media treatment of this is we don't see the kind of emotional response that is appropriate to the immense suffering of the children and the people, the innocent people in Gaza. This is very disturbing. There's this obliviousness to the human tragedy. I can't help comparing it to what's been going on with these poor buggers in Indonesia. We've got wall-to-wall coverage of every single aspect of this tragedy. I'm not minimising the problem, but it doesn't deserve, comparatively, the kind of media treatment when 500 children, torn to shreds under the rubble, for which we're responsible in this case, for which we can do something about. Now that's the kind of issue I think you're raising, and it's to do with what we need to do to raise, and this is what the Russell Tribunal and the original one of Vietnam was exactly about, that we weren't responding in a human way. One of the things I mentioned in my speech when I gave it at the town hall was exactly this point, and I cited, as you may have seen, Christopher Gunnis is his name, a UN person who was being interviewed on camera. He's the UN representative for UNRWA, or whatever it is there. And he started to talk on camera and he simply broke down crying. He couldn't talk. It was very moving because he didn't actually say anything, but he mentioned the children and he just broke down.
Yeah.
And my question is, why isn't anybody else responding that way? That's the human reaction, and we have this complete indifference. That's the problem that they're facing.
Now, there was people like Isaac Deutscher and Vladimir Dedejer and Russell himself, but all these people are dead, so who's keeping the tribunal going?
Well, people like Dr. Slezak. Look, I think it's all our responsibility. I can't remember what the membership was in New York when it was reconvened for the first time to address the Israeli atrocities. I can't remember, but look, we've been asked that maybe Jake doesn't know this, but we were asked, or I can't remember if it was the Sydney Peace Foundation or the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, to convene a Russell Tribunal in Sydney. But when the amount of time and effort we needed and the cash we needed to sustain it, we were like, as usual, like the proverbial cat on a hot tin roof, because we were being asked, why don't you do something about the genocide in West Papua? And what about the 40,000 people murdered in the Sri Lankan Civil War? So it was, those demands are endless, and we didn't, I mean, the nearest we've got to it is putting the topic of the politics and the pub agenda. But it's maybe something we should seriously think about, and it wouldn't be difficult to get prominent people to sit as the quasi-judges on such a tribunal. And we would have responsibility, like the last question about the children, to say how serious are the people of this country about the rights of the child.
Michael, Heather, can I just break the rules? There seems to be precedent for it. And just give a partisan comment. You referred earlier to Bob Carr, after many years seeing the light and making a heavily qualified and mild criticism about Israel. And what happened? Tanya Plibersek came out and attacked him for it. Now, that's the reality in Australia of where we are, and it relates to a lot of the questions here tonight. You can't do any fucking thing.
Well, I'd like you to define any fucking thing. Look, you know, when I was a kid, and you probably all had the same experience. I didn't have the guts to jump off of a high board in a swimming pool. And you know, the question was whether I'd jump off, do it straight away, or whether I'd jump off a lower one and then a slightly higher one. And with regard to the members of the ALP, that's the process we're in. Why didn't you take a risk? Why didn't you say it? Why didn't you say it without looking over your shoulder? Why didn't you look at the terms of reference of the Australian Labor Party and say it loudly? And we're coming up to we're slowly winning this, I think, because Bob Carr was, he did jump off the 2'6" board. Not over, he's going to jump off the 4-foot board and maybe the 5-metre board later, by the time of the National Conference of the ALP at the end of July, August. That's going to be the time when they will be presented with a motion to recognise the state of Palestine. Unequivocally, no caveats. And I can tell you there's a very carefully planned campaign underway to try to ensure that that happens. And oddly enough, that campaign ought to be mirrored by the effort to dramatise the cruelty to children, which we collude with. But you have to be single-minded about something like that. You can't take your eyes off the ball. You have to, almost every waking hour between now and when that national conference assembles, to say that even Tanya Plibersek and not just Tanya, she's going to be easy compared to Bill Shorten.
Let me add one other thing on Labor Party politics. We shouldn't have this discussion without mentioning one of the heroes who have spoken out, and that's Melissa Parker. And it was on BDS. And to her great credit, she stood up and gave a speech in Parliament, got a lot of flack for it in the Canberra Times and elsewhere, but that's a significant development, and I think this may embolden others, as Stuart's saying. So credit where credit is due in that case.
On a practical note, first of all, I do have a few copies of this very good booklet by Australian Friends of Palestine, which is an instruction booklet for how you too can join in the BDS campaign. It lists products and businesses we should avoid. Imagine my dismay when I found out I could no longer buy my underwear from Victoria's Secret, for example. But, the other thing I should say is that I've recently become an Australian citizen, and therefore entitled. And I have found out that when you go to vote in a federal election, of course, one is obliged to fill in the voting form all the way down if it's going to be counted. And this is one of the reasons why we are so continually frustrated with the pusillanimity, to use your word, Stuart, of the Australian Labor Party, because they have an incentive only to be slightly less appalling than the coalition, and they know that ultimately our preferences will flow to them. Well, my proposal is therefore to say, well, we are a campaign of people who would usually, ultimately, vote Labour. But we're not going to do so to any Labour MP who refuses to recognise the state of Palestine. And we might say any Labour MP who refuses to promise never again to lock up refugee children. They would be two very modest demands which should be second nature for any progressive party worth its name. And if that movement were to take off, then there would be some jeopardy on the other side of the equation for the first time in many a long election year.
Yay.